Some wounds never heal, they just teach us to live alone. For 7 years, mountain man Silas McGraw has hidden in the Montana wilderness, convinced that solitude is safer than risking his heart again. When a fierce blizzard traps him in his remote cabin, he expects 3 days of familiar isolation. Then schoolteacher Eleanor Whitfield appears at his door through the storm, carrying supplies and something far more dangerous: hope. She looks him in the eyes and declares, "You belong to me now." Stepping inside without invitation. What happens when someone refuses to let you stay broken? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled like a living thing through the pines, rattling the sturdy logs of Silas McGraw's cabin with the fury of a Montana winter that showed no mercy. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, each flake adding weight to the silence that had become his closest companion. 7 years he had lived this way. 7 years of watching seasons change through windows he rarely opened, of speaking only to the wind and the occasional deer that wandered close enough to share his solitude. His calloused hands moved with practiced precision as he whittled another piece of pine, the knife blade catching the firelight as he shaped what might become a bird, or perhaps nothing at all. The worn leather journal lay open beside him, pages filled with sketches that spoke of a different life. A woman's gentle smile captured in careful pencil strokes, a child's laughter frozen in charcoal. These images were all that remained of Martha and little Sarah, and he guarded them more fiercely than any treasure. The storm had been building for 2 days, and Silas knew from experience that he would be trapped for at least another day, maybe 2. He welcomed the isolation. The outside world held nothing for him anymore, nothing but memories that cut deeper than any mountain winter. His provisions were well stocked: salted meat, dried beans, cornmeal, and coffee that he rationed like gold. The cabin was warm, the fire steady, and his solitude complete, just the way he preferred it. Martha used to say he was too social for his own good, always inviting neighbors for dinner, always ready with a helping hand or a shared laugh. She teased him about his need to fix everyone's problems, to be the strong shoulder that others leaned on. That was before the fever took them both while he was away, fighting in a war that took everything from him. Now the very thought of human contact felt like standing too close to a flame. It promised warmth, but guaranteed burns. The knock came soft at first, barely audible above the wind's roar. Silas paused, knife suspended mid-cut, thinking the storm was playing tricks on his ears. No one traveled in weather like this. No one even knew where his cabin stood, hidden as it was among the towering pines and granite outcroppings of the high country. He had chosen this place precisely because it promised invisibility, a sanctuary where the world could not reach him. The second knock was firmer, more insistent. 3 measured raps that spoke of determination rather than desperation. Silas set down his whittling and reached for the rifle that never strayed far from his side. In 7 years, no visitor had found their way to his door. Travelers who lost their way usually called out, shouted for help against the storm. This quiet persistence suggested either someone with intimate knowledge of his location or someone with patience enough to wait for an answer. He moved to the window and brushed away the frost that had gathered on the glass. Through the swirling white, he could make out a figure on his small covered porch, slight, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, carrying what appeared to be a woven basket. The person stood with remarkable stillness, considering the wind that whipped around them, waiting with the patience of someone accustomed to being heard when they spoke. "Who's there?" Silas called through the door, his voice rusty from disuse. "Eleanor Whitfield," came the reply, clear and steady despite the storm. "I've brought supplies." The name meant nothing to him, though something in the tone, calm, sure, unafraid, gave him pause. No one brought supplies to Silas McGraw. He needed nothing from the world below, wanted nothing from the people who had learned to live without him, as surely as he had learned to live without them. "Don't need supplies," he called back. "Best you head on back before this storm gets worse." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Eleanor replied, and there was something almost amused in her voice, as if his gruff dismissal had been expected. "The trail's already impassable, and my horse is getting restless. I'll need shelter until it passes." Silas closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against the cold door. This was exactly what he had spent 7 years avoiding. The complications that came with other people, the obligations and expectations that followed human contact like shadows. He had built his life around the simple principle that the safest distance between himself and heartbreak was the width of these mountains. "There's an old trapper's hut about 2 miles south," he offered. "Stone foundation, good roof. You can weather it there." "Mr. McGraw," Eleanor said, and the fact that she knew his name sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through the doorframe. "I'm not going anywhere in this storm, and neither are you. Now, you can open this door, and we can have a civilized conversation by your fire, or I can stand out here until the wind stops howling and we can both be miserable. But I promise you, I'm not leaving without speaking my piece." The quiet authority in her voice reminded him of Martha, not the tone, but the unmistakable certainty of a woman who had made up her mind. It was a sound he had not heard in 7 years. And it stirred something in his chest that he had thought long buried beneath layers of grief and deliberate numbness, against every instinct that had kept him safe and alone. Silas found himself lifting the heavy wooden bar that secured his door. The wind caught it immediately, threatening to tear it from his grip, but he held firm and pulled it open wide enough for Eleanor to step inside. She moved past him with the unhurried grace of someone comfortable in any surroundings, snow melting from her dark wool coat onto his carefully swept floor. The basket in her arms was indeed woven, crafted with the kind of skill that spoke of time and care, and it smelled of fresh bread and something warm and savory that made his mouth water, despite himself. "Close the door, Mr. McGraw," she said without turning around, already surveying his cabin with eyes that missed nothing. "You're letting the heat out." Silas closed the door and secured it again, acutely aware that he had just trapped himself with a stranger, something he had sworn never to do again. She was smaller than he had expected, barely reaching his shoulder, with graying brown hair pinned back in a practical style, and eyes the color of coffee with cream. There was nothing particularly remarkable about her appearance, nothing that would make a man stop and stare, but something in the way she carried herself suggested depths that might prove dangerous to explore. "You know my name," he said, leaning against the door with his arms crossed. "But I don't recall making your acquaintance, Mrs. Whitfield," she corrected gently, though he noticed no ring on her finger. "And we haven't been introduced properly, though I know a great deal about you. I teach at the school in Pine Ridge, and I've been hearing stories about the hermit in the mountains for some time now." She set the basket on his rough-hewn table and began unpacking it with the efficiency of someone who had planned this visit carefully. Fresh bread wrapped in clean linen, a jar of what looked like beef stew, apples that must have cost a fortune this time of year, and various items he could not identify from where he stood. "Stories," he repeated, not moving from his position by the door. The rifle was within easy reach, though something told him this particular visitor posed no physical threat. "What kind of stories?" Eleanor looked up from her unpacking and smiled, her expression so genuine and warm that it hit him like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had smiled at him? When was the last time someone had looked at him without pity or fear or the careful distance that people maintained around those touched by tragedy? "The kind that make a woman worry," she said simply. "Stories about a man who used to be part of a community, who had friends and neighbors, who helped raise barn roofs and shared Sunday dinners. Stories about a man who lost everything and decided that meant he had to lose everyone too. Silas felt his jaw tighten. Don't know what business that is of yours. Perhaps none, Eleanor agreed, pulling a small wooden box from the bottom of the basket. But when someone disappears from the world, especially someone who mattered to people, it becomes everyone's business in a way. People remember kindness, Mr. McGraw. They remember help given freely, friendship offered without condition. When that person vanishes into the mountains and is seen only as a shadow moving between the trees, people notice, people worry. She opened the wooden box, and the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg filled the cabin, spices that belonged to civilization, to kitchens filled with laughter and tables surrounded by family. The contrast between that warm, domestic smell and the stark functionality of his hermit's existence could not have been more pronounced. People forget, Silas said roughly. They move on. They find other folks to worry about. Eleanor looked at him with those coffee-colored eyes, and he felt as if she were seeing straight through all the walls he had built, all the distance he had cultivated, right down to the raw wound that still bled whenever he let himself remember. What it felt like to belong somewhere. Some people do, she agreed. But teachers, Mr. McGraw, teachers remember every student who passes through their classroom. Every parent who trusts them with their children, every member of the community who makes their work possible. And I remember a man who helped build the schoolhouse where I teach, who donated books from his own collection, who made sure every child had what they needed to learn. The memory hit him like an avalanche. The smell of sawdust and fresh paint, the satisfaction of raising walls that would shelter knowledge and dreams, the sight of Martha's proud smile as she watched him help create something lasting. He had forgotten that Eleanor's school was the same building, that his hands had shaped the very walls that now sheltered her work. That was a long time ago, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. 7 years. Eleanor agreed, beginning to move around his cabin with the confidence of someone who belonged there. She hung her coat on a peg by the door, revealing a simple brown dress that had seen better days, but was clean and carefully mended. 7 years of people wondering if you were well, if you had enough supplies, if the winters were too harsh, if you were— She paused, choosing her words carefully. If you were still fighting the war that took you away from us. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire, visible and present and impossible to ignore. Silas had not spoken of the war to anyone, had buried those memories as deeply as he had buried his grief. The idea that his absence had been interpreted as ongoing battle rather than simple withdrawal was both disturbing and oddly comforting. "I'm not fighting anything," he said finally. "I'm just living quiet." Eleanor moved to his fireplace and held her hands out to the flames, and in the flickering light he could see that her fingers were calloused from work, that her face bore the lines that came from years of patient teaching and careful responsibility. This was not some young idealist come to save his soul, but a woman who had lived enough life to understand that healing happened in its own time, in its own way. "There's a difference between living quiet and living alone," she said without turning around. "One's a choice about how you want to spend your days. The other's a choice about whether you want to spend them at all." The truth of it hit him harder than he had expected. For 7 years he had told himself that his isolation was about peace, about avoiding the complications and disappointments that came with human connection. But standing there, watching this stranger move through his space with such natural ease, he realized how much of his choice had been about punishment. Punishment for surviving when Martha and Sarah had not. Punishment for being away when they needed him most. Punishment for the crime of continuing to draw breath in a world that felt emptied of meaning. "Why are you here?" he asked. And this time there was no hostility in the question, only a weary curiosity about what could have driven her out into a storm to find a man who had made it clear he wanted to stay lost. Eleanor turned from the fire and looked at him directly, and in her eyes he saw something he had not expected. Recognition, not the recognition of fame or reputation, but the deeper recognition of one wounded soul acknowledging another. "Because," she said quietly, "you belong to me now." The words hung between them, like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Silas stared at Eleanor, trying to make sense of what she had just said, trying to understand how 4 simple words could feel like both a promise and a threat. "I don't belong to anyone," he said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "Haven't for 7 years, and that's the way I prefer it." Eleanor moved away from the fire, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She reached into her basket and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth, setting it carefully on his table before unwrapping it to reveal medical supplies. Clean bandages, a bottle of carbolic acid, needle and thread, and various herbs he recognized as having healing properties. "You've been favoring your left leg for the past month," she said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "Joe Henderson saw you limping when you came down to trade for coffee at Miller's store. Said you looked like you were trying not to show it, but a man doesn't change the way he's walked his whole life without good reason." Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm rattling his windows. "You've been watching me." "The whole town's been watching you," Eleanor corrected, "or rather watching for you. 7 years, Mr. McGraw, and you think you've been invisible. But people notice when someone who used to matter stops mattering to himself. They notice when a good man disappears into the mountains and only comes down when desperation drives him." She began arranging the medical supplies with the efficiency of someone who had tended wounds before. Silas found himself backing toward the wall, uncomfortable with how easily she had read him, how clearly she had seen through his carefully maintained independence. "People watch because they care," Eleanor continued, not looking at him as she prepared what was obviously a planned intervention. "They watch because they remember who you were before grief tried to convince you that isolation was the same thing as healing. And when someone who's been watching notices that you're hurt and trying to hide it, well," she looked up then, meeting his eyes directly. "That's when watching turns into acting." "I'm fine," Silas said automatically, though even as the words left his mouth, he was aware of the throbbing pain in his left thigh where he had gashed it on a broken branch 3 weeks ago. The wound had been deeper than he had first realized, and despite his efforts to clean and dress it, infection had begun to set in. He had been treating it with what supplies he had, but Eleanor's trained eye had obviously seen what he had hoped. "To conceal your many things, Mr. McGraw," Eleanor said with the patient tone of someone accustomed to dealing with stubborn men. "But fine isn't one of them. Now, you can sit down and let me look at that leg, or you can keep pretending that 7 years of isolation has made you superhuman, but I didn't risk my life in a blizzard to play games with a man too proud to accept help." There was something in her voice, not quite anger, but a kind of gentle implacability that reminded him powerfully of his mother. It was the tone women used when they had made up their minds about something important, when resistance would only delay the inevitable. "Why?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "Why risk coming up here? Why bring supplies? Why care what happens to some hermit who's made it clear he wants nothing to do with the world?" Eleanor paused in her preparations and looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. There was sadness there and determination, but also something that looked almost like recognition. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything," she said quietly. "I know what it's like to decide that if the world can take away everything you love, then the safest thing is to love nothing at all. And I know that the longer you live that way, the easier it becomes to believe that's the way things have to be." She reached into her basket again and withdrew something that made Silas's breath catch in his throat. A small wooden horse, carved with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of love and countless hours of patient work. It was clearly a child's toy, worn smooth by small hands, with paint faded but still visible on its mane and saddle. "This belonged to my son," Eleanor said, holding the horse gently, as if it were made of spun glass. "Thomas, he would have been 15 this year if the fever hadn't taken him when he was 7. I made this toy the last Christmas we had together, spent weeks carving it while he was asleep, painting it with colors he loved. After he died, I couldn't bear to look at it, couldn't bear to touch it. I put it away and told myself I was preserving his memory. Silas found himself moving closer despite every instinct that told him to maintain distance. There was something about the way she held the wooden horse, something about the careful gentleness in her voice that spoke to the part of him that still remembered what it felt like to hold his daughter's favorite doll after the fever had claimed her. But preserving memory and preserving love aren't the same thing, Eleanor continued. Memory keeps the past exactly as it was, perfect and untouchable and separate from who we are now. Love, she looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw the same deep ache that he carried, the same wound that never quite healed. Love asks us to carry the best of what we've lost into whatever comes next. It asks us to let the people we've loved change us, not just hurt us. She set the wooden horse carefully on the table next to the medical supplies, and Silas realized that she had not brought it by accident. This was not just a story she was telling him. This was her way of showing him that she understood, that she knew the geography of grief as intimately as he did. So when people in town started talking about the hermit in the mountains who used to help build schools and raise barns, when they started worrying about whether he was taking care of himself or just waiting for the mountains to claim him, I listened. And when Joe Henderson mentioned that the hermit seemed to be limping, seemed to be in pain he was trying to hide, I knew I had to do something. Because of your son, Silas said, beginning to understand. Because of my son, Eleanor. Agreed, because Thomas taught me that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just has to find new ways to express itself. And sometimes that means refusing to let other people disappear, even when they've convinced themselves that's what they want. She moved toward him then, slowly, and without any sign of fear, though he was still a large man and she was alone with him in the middle of nowhere. Her lack of concern for her own safety was either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish, and Silas was not sure which possibility disturbed him more. "Let me look at your leg," she said. And it was not really a request. Let me help you the way Thomas would want me to help you, the way I wish someone had been there to help him when I couldn't. Silas looked at her for a long moment, this small, determined woman who had risked everything to bring healing to someone who had not asked for it. He thought of Martha, who had always said that the worst sin was not accepting grace when it was offered freely. He thought of Sarah, who had never met a stranger, who had believed that everyone was just a friend she had not yet made. And for the first time in 7 years, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that Eleanor Whitfield might be right, that belonging to someone did not have to mean losing himself, that accepting care did not have to mean accepting vulnerability, that letting someone matter to him again did not have to end in heartbreak. "All right," he said quietly, moving toward the chair by the fire. "All right." Eleanor smiled then, and it was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. "That's the first sensible thing you've said since I arrived," she said, and began, rolling up her sleeves. "Now sit down and let me see what you've been hiding." As Silas lowered himself into the chair and began unlacing his boot, he realized that something fundamental had shifted in his carefully ordered world. For 7 years, he had been the sole author of his days, responsible to no one, accountable to nothing but his own desire to remain untouched by the complications of human connection. But Eleanor Whitfield had walked through his door, carrying a basket and a wooden horse, and the quiet certainty that he was worth saving, and now he was no longer alone in the mountains. Now he belonged to someone again, whether he had chosen it or not. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, as Eleanor knelt beside his chair and began examining his injured leg with gentle, competent hands, Silas found himself wondering if belonging to someone again might not be the worst thing that could happen to a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be cared for. Outside, the storm continued to rage. But inside the cabin, something warmer than fire had begun to burn. CT. Infection was worse than Eleanor had expected, but not worse than she had feared. As she cleaned the wound with carbolic acid and Silas gritted his teeth against the pain, she found herself studying the man who had become legend in Pine Ridge, the hermit who helped ghosts, the shadow who appeared at Miller's store just long enough to trade pelts for coffee and supplies before vanishing back into the high country. Up close, she could see that the stories had gotten some things wrong. He was not the wild, unkempt creature that rumors sometimes painted him as. His hair was long and his beard full, but both were clean and well-tended. His clothes were patched but cared for, his cabin organized with the precision of someone who had learned that survival depended on knowing where everything belonged. This was not a man who had given up on life, but rather one who had learned to live it very carefully. "This is going to sting," she warned, threading the needle to close. "The deeper part of the gash already does," Silas muttered. But he sat still as stone while she worked, his knuckles white where he gripped the chair arms. Eleanor found herself admiring his self-control. She had tended enough wounds to know that strong men often made the worst patients, their pride warring with their pain, until both became unbearable. But Silas seemed to accept the discomfort as a natural consequence of his choices, enduring it with the same quiet determination that had probably kept him alive through 7 Montana winters. "Tell me about the school," he said suddenly, his voice tight but steady. "Are the children learning well?" The question surprised her. She had expected him to retreat into silence, to endure her ministrations with stoic detachment. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested, as if the act of being cared for had awakened some long-dormant part of himself that remembered how to make conversation. "Better than I sometimes deserve," Eleanor said, carefully placing her stitches. 16 children this year, from 5 to 14. The Hendricks twins are reading at a level that would challenge some adults, and little Mary Chen has a gift for numbers that makes me think she could be an accountant someday, if the world ever makes room for such dreams. And if it doesn't, Eleanor paused in her work, considering the question. "Then I'll have taught her to think clearly and calculate accurately, and those skills will serve her wherever life takes her. That's what education really is, you know, not just filling minds with facts, but teaching people to use those minds." Well, Silas was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him studying her profile as she bent over his leg. "You sound like you really believe that." "I have to," Eleanor said simply. "Otherwise, what's the point? If I'm just going through motions, if I'm just keeping children occupied until they're old enough to work, then I'm wasting everyone's time. But if I can teach them to think, to question, to imagine possibilities they can't see yet," she tied off the last stitch and reached for a clean bandage, "then maybe I'm giving them something that will matter long after they've forgotten the capitals of states they'll never visit." She began wrapping his leg with practiced efficiency, aware that her hands had steadied as she talked about her work. Teaching was the one thing in her life that had never failed her, never disappointed her, never left her wondering if she had made the right choices. Even when grief had threatened to overwhelm her after Thomas's death, even when the loneliness had seemed vast enough to swallow her whole, she had been able to walk into that schoolhouse and find purpose in young faces eager to learn. "The building's holding up well," she continued, testing the tightness of the bandage. "The roof you helped put on hasn't leaked once in 7 years, even during the worst storms. The children sit at desks you helped build, learning from books you helped buy. Every day I teach in that school, I'm reminded that some good things last longer than the people who create them." Silas looked uncomfortable with the praise, shifting in his chair as if gratitude was something he no longer knew how to accept. "Just did what needed doing. Wasn't anything special, wasn't it?" Eleanor sat back on her heels and looked at him directly. "When did helping your community stop being special? When did contributing something lasting stop mattering to you?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Silas stared into the fire, his jaw working as if he were chewing on words he did not want to speak. Finally he said, "When I realized that all the good I thought I was doing didn't amount to much, when the people I cared about most needed me. When I understood that being helpful to everyone meant I wasn't there for the ones who mattered." Eleanor finished packing away her medical supplies, giving him time to continue if he chose to. When he remained silent, she said gently, "You were at war. That's not the same as choosing to be absent." Felt the same to Martha and Sarah. The names hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Eleanor had heard them whispered in town, always accompanied by headshakes and expressions of sympathy. The wife and daughter who had died of fever while Silas fought for the Union, the tragedy that had driven a good man into the mountains. But hearing him speak their names himself, hearing the weight of grief and guilt in his voice, made their loss feel immediate and present in a way that gossip never could. "They knew you loved them," Eleanor said quietly. "Love doesn't cure fever. Love doesn't keep people alive when they're burning up and calling for someone who's 1,000 miles away, fighting someone else's war." Silas's voice was barely above, a whisper, but each word carried the weight of 7 years' worth of self-recrimination. "Martha wrote me letters, told me not to worry, told me they were fine, told me to come home safe. Never mentioned how sick they were getting, never asked me to come back, just kept telling me she loved me and to be careful." Eleanor felt her heart clench with recognition. She understood the particular cruelty of losing someone who had protected you from their own suffering, someone who had chosen to spare you pain even as they endured their own. It was a gift that felt like betrayal, love that expressed itself through secrets that robbed you of the chance to choose them over everything else. "She was trying to take care of you," Eleanor said. "Even while she was dying, she was trying to make sure you could do what you thought was right without being torn apart by worry. And I let her." Silas's hands clenched into fists. "I let her carry that burden alone because it was easier than coming home and facing the choice between duty and love. I told myself I was being noble, fighting for something bigger than myself. Really, I was just being a coward." Eleanor stood and moved to the small window that faced east, toward the town where people still spoke his name with respect and affection. Snow continued to fall in thick curtains, but she could see patches where the wind had died down, where individual flakes danced rather than driving horizontally through the air. "You know what I remember about the fever outbreak that took your family?" she said without turning around. "I remember how it spread so fast that no one could keep up with who was sick and who wasn't. I remember how people were dying faster than we could bury them, how the doctor worked himself into exhaustion trying to save people and still lost more than half of his patients. I remember how those of us who stayed healthy did everything we could think of, and it still wasn't enough." She turned back to face him, her expression serious but not unkind. "What I don't remember is anyone saying that if only Silas McGraw had been here, if only one more person had been available to help, everything would have been different, because fever doesn't care how many people are fighting it, Mr. McGraw. It doesn't care how much love is in a room or how desperate someone is to save the people they care about. Sometimes terrible things happen, and there's nothing anyone can do to stop them." Silas stared at her, his expression shifting between disbelief and something that might have been hope. "You think it wouldn't have mattered if I'd been here?" "I think it would have mattered enormously," Eleanor said, "but not in the way you mean. It wouldn't have saved them. Fever had already made that choice. But it would have meant they didn't die alone. It would have meant you got to tell them goodbye. It would have meant you were holding their hands when they left, instead of holding on to guilt for the rest of your life." She moved back to the chair across from him and sat down, her small slate board balanced on her knees. It was a habit she had developed over years of teaching. Whenever she needed to think clearly, whenever she needed to work through a problem, she found comfort in having the familiar weight of the slate in her hands. "The children ask about you. Sometimes," she said, beginning to sketch absently on the slate with a piece of chalk, The older ones remember when you used to come to town regularly, remember seeing you at church suppers and barn raisings. They wonder what happened to the man who used to bring them carved animals and teach them how to whistle. Silas watched her hands move across the slate, watched as the outline of a bird began to emerge from her careful strokes. What do you tell them? The truth, as much of it as they can understand. That sometimes when people lose everything that matters to them, they need time to figure out how to live in the world again. That healing takes different shapes for different people, and there's no shame in needing space to grieve. Eleanor looked up from her sketching to find Silas watching her with an expression she could not quite read. There was surprise there, and something that might have been gratitude, but also a wariness that suggested he was not quite ready to believe that his story could be understood without judgment. But I also tell them, she continued, that 7 years is a long time to spend healing, that sometimes people get so comfortable with their grief that they forget it's supposed to be temporary. That sometimes the kindest thing friends can do is remind each other that life is still happening, even when it doesn't feel like it. The fire popped and settled, sending sparks up the chimney and filling the cabin with the warm scent of burning pine. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, but inside, Eleanor felt something beginning to shift. Not just in Silas, but in the space between them. The careful distance he had maintained was still there, but it no longer felt quite so absolute. Is that what you're doing? Silas asked quietly, reminding me that life is still happening. Eleanor set down her chalk and looked at him directly. I'm trying to remind you that you're still happening, Mr. McGraw, that the man who helped build schools and carved toys for children and made his neighbors feel a little less alone in the world, that man didn't die with your family. He just went into hiding, and maybe it's time for him to come back. She stood and moved to the basket she had brought, withdrawing a loaf of bread that filled the cabin with the scent of yeast and home. But first, she said, I think we should eat something. Healing's hungry work, whether it's a wounded leg or a wounded heart. As she began slicing the bread with his hunting knife, Eleanor allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she had been right to risk the storm. Maybe Silas McGraw was ready to remember what it felt like to belong to someone again, even if he was not quite ready to admit it yet. The bread was the best thing Silas had tasted in 7 years. Not because Eleanor was an exceptional baker, though she was certainly competent, but because it had been 7 years since he had eaten anything prepared by hands that cared whether he enjoyed it. His own cooking was purely functional, fuel for a body that needed to keep working. But this bread had been made with intention, with the kind of attention to detail that came from wanting to provide comfort as well as sustenance. They ate in companionable silence at first, the storm providing a constant backdrop of wind and snow against the windows. Eleanor had found his chessboard without being told where to look, had set it up on the small table between their chairs with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to making herself at home anywhere she went. The highest carved pieces caught the firelight, each one shaped with the careful attention to detail that had once been his greatest pleasure. You made these, Eleanor said, not a question, but an observation as she moved a pawn forward 2 squares. Silas nodded, studying the board and trying to remember the last time he had played with an actual opponent rather than against himself. Took me most of a winter, had a lot of time to fill. Eleanor's move was conservative but sound, the choice of someone who understood the game well enough to avoid early mistakes. Silas responded with his own pawn, and they began the ancient dance of strategy and patience that had entertained minds for centuries. Do you remember teaching me to play? Eleanor asked after several moves had been exchanged. Silas looked up sharply, studying her face in the firelight. There was something familiar about the shape of her smile, something that tugged at memories he had not examined in years. I'm sorry, I don't. Eleanor Hartwell, then, she said gently. I was 16, and my father brought me to one of the church socials. You were there with Martha, and Sarah was just learning to walk. She kept trying to grab the chess pieces while you were teaching me the names of all the moves. The memory came flooding back with startling clarity. A shy girl with serious eyes and an eager mind, her father proudly explaining that his daughter was the smartest student the traveling teacher had ever encountered. Silas remembered being impressed by her quick grasp of strategy, by the way she asked questions that showed she was thinking several moves ahead. Eleanor Hartwell, he repeated, shaking his head at his own blindness. You married Tom Whitfield. The year after Martha died. Had a little boy. He stopped, understanding flooding through him. Thomas. Thomas, she confirmed, moving her bishop to threaten his knight. Tom died in a mining accident when Thomas was 3. After that, it was just the 2 of us until the fever took him. Silas moved his knight to safety, but his attention was no longer fully on the game. He was remembering Eleanor as a young woman, bright and eager and full of plans for the future. She had wanted to be a teacher even then, had talked about establishing a proper school where children could learn more than just reading and arithmetic. Tom Whitfield had been a good man, steady and kind, the sort of husband any father would want for his daughter. I should have remembered you, Silas said, feeling ashamed of his failure to recognize someone who had once been part of his community, part of the network of relationships that had given his life meaning and structure. You knew Eleanor Hartwell, she said, castling her king to safety with practiced ease, a 16-year-old girl who thought she knew everything about the world and was eager to prove it. Eleanor Whitfield is someone different, a woman who learned that the world has a talent for proving you wrong about nearly everything you think you know. Silas studied the board, but more than that, he studied the woman across from him. The serious-eyed girl was still there, visible in the way Eleanor considered her moves, in the careful intelligence behind her choices. But she was overlaid now with the kind of depth that came from loss, from learning that good intentions were not always enough, from discovering that love could break your heart and still be worth the risk. How do you do it? He asked suddenly. How do you keep going to that school every day, teaching other people's children, when I lost my own? Eleanor moved her queen to support her developing attack. Some days I don't know. Some days I stand outside that schoolhouse and wonder if I have anything left to give them, if I'm just going through motions and pretending it matters. She paused, studying the board, but clearly seeing something beyond the arrangement of wooden pieces. But then I go inside, and Mary Chen shows me how she's figured out a new way to solve long division, or the Henderson twins bring me a story they've written together, or little Samuel Morrison finally manages to read a whole paragraph without stumbling. And I remember that teaching isn't about replacing what I've lost. It's about honoring it. Silas made his move without really thinking, his attention focused entirely on Eleanor's words. Honoring it. Thomas loved to learn, she said simply. He was always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked, why people made the choices they did, what would happen if you tried something different. Every time I help another child discover that same curiosity, every time I see that light come on in young eyes, I feel like I'm keeping part of Thomas alive in the world. She looked up from the board, meeting his gaze directly. The love doesn't go away, Mr. McGraw. It just has to find new ways to express itself. And sometimes the best way to honor the people we've lost is to make sure their capacity for love doesn't die with them. Silas felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of knots that had been tied tight for 7 years. He had been so focused on preserving his grief, on keeping Martha and Sarah's memory exactly as it had been, that he had never considered the possibility that love might be meant to grow and change, even after the beloved were gone. Martha used to say that the measure of a good life wasn't how much you accomplished for yourself, but how much you helped other people accomplish for themselves, he said quietly. She would have liked what you're doing with those children. Eleanor smiled, and it was like watching sunrise after a long winter night. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. Smarter than me about most things, though she was too polite to say so directly. Silas moved his rook, finally focusing on the game again. Sarah was the same way. Used to correct my grammar when she was 4 years old, but she'd always say, "Please," first, as if she was asking permission to be smarter than her father. "Tell me about them," Eleanor said, and there was no pity in her voice, no careful sympathy, just genuine interest, as if Martha and Sarah were people she would have liked to know rather than tragedies to be mourned. So Silas told her. He told her about Martha's laugh, which had been louder and more infectious than her quiet demeanor would have suggested. He told her about Sarah's fascination with birds, how she could identify different species by their calls before she could properly tie her own shoes. He told her about Sunday mornings, when Martha would insist on making elaborate breakfasts that took half the day to prepare, about evenings when Sarah would fall asleep in his lap while he read to her from whatever book had captured her imagination. That week, as he talked, Eleanor continued to play chess with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else, but he could see that she was listening intently, filing away details, building a picture of the family he had lost. Her questions were thoughtful and specific, designed to draw out memories he had not shared with anyone, stories he had kept locked away for fear that speaking them aloud would somehow diminish their power to comfort him. "They sound wonderful," she said, when he finally ran out of stories, when the emotion in his voice made it clear that he needed to stop before he said too much. "No wonder you've missed them so deeply." "Missing them isn't the problem," Silas said, moving his queen into position for what he hoped would be a winning combination. "The problem is that missing them became easier than living without them. Grief can be a comfortable place to hide if you're not careful. It asks nothing of you, except that you keep feeling bad about what you've lost." Eleanor studied the board for a long moment, then made a move that completely disrupted his planned attack. "But you weren't just hiding from grief, were you? You were hiding from the possibility of losing someone else." The observation was so accurate, it felt like a physical blow. Silas stared at her, wondering how she had seen so clearly, through defenses he had not even realized he was maintaining. For 7 years, he had told himself that his isolation was about honoring Martha and Sarah, about creating a space where their memory could live undisturbed. But Eleanor was right. It was also about ensuring that he would never again experience the particular agony of loving someone and then watching them slip away, despite everything he tried to do to save them. "Maybe," he admitted, "maybe I was hiding from that too. And now?" Silas looked around his cabin, seeing it suddenly through Eleanor's eyes. The carefully organized shelves, the precisely maintained tools, the solitary chair by the fire, all of it spoke to a life that had been arranged to avoid complications, to minimize the chance that anything unexpected or painful could intrude. It was the home of a man who had chosen safety over connection, predictability over possibility. But Eleanor was here now, had walked through his door carrying supplies and stories and the quiet insistence that he deserved better than the half-life he had constructed for himself. Her presence changed everything about the space, made it feel less like a refuge and more like what it really was. A beautiful prison he had built to keep the world out and himself safely contained within its walls. "Now I'm not sure hiding is working as well as it used to," he said finally. Eleanor smiled and moved her bishop, placing his king in check. "Good," she said. "That means you're ready to start living again instead of just surviving." As Silas studied the board, looking for a way to save his king from Eleanor's methodical attack, he realized that the metaphor was uncomfortably apt. For 7 years, he had been playing defense, reacting to threats rather than pursuing opportunities, focused entirely on avoiding loss rather than seeking gain. But Eleanor had walked into his carefully controlled world and forced him to consider the possibility that there might be more to life than simply enduring it. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, something warmer than fire was beginning to burn, something that felt dangerously like hope. The storm broke on the 3rd morning, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and silence. Silas woke to sunlight streaming through his windows for the first time in days, the familiar weight of solitude, replaced by the strange comfort of knowing Eleanor was sleeping in Martha's old rocking chair by the fire, wrapped in blankets she had insisted were perfectly adequate despite his offer of the bed. He had lain awake for hours, listening to her breathe, marveling at how different his cabin felt with another heartbeat sharing its space. For 7 years, the only sounds had been his own, his footsteps on the plank floor, his voice talking to himself or reading aloud from his few books, the solitary rhythm of a life pared down to its essential functions. But Eleanor's presence had filled the space with subtle music, the whisper of fabric as she moved in her sleep, the soft sigh of her breathing, the occasional murmur that suggested dreams more peaceful than any he had known in recent memory. Now, watching her wake slowly in the morning light, he found himself studying her face with the same careful attention he had once given to his woodcarving. There were lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent squinting at children's homework by lamplight, a small scar on her chin that suggested some childhood adventure, a strength in the set of her jaw that had probably served her well in the years she had raised Thomas alone. She was not beautiful in the way that Martha had been beautiful. Martha had been all golden hair and easy laughter, the kind of woman who drew eyes without trying. But Eleanor had something else, something that went deeper than surface prettiness. She had the kind of face that improved with acquaintance, that revealed new depths each time you thought you had seen all it had to offer. "Good morning," she said, catching him watching her. If she was embarrassed by his scrutiny, she did not show it. Instead, she stretched like a cat in the sunshine, working the kinks out of muscles that had spent the night in a chair designed for rocking, not sleeping. "Morning," Silas replied, suddenly conscious of how rough his voice sounded after a night of careful silence. "Coffee, please." Eleanor folded the blankets with practiced efficiency and began braiding her hair, which had come loose during the night. The simple domestic gesture struck him as more intimate than anything they had shared during their long conversations by the fire. There was something about watching a woman prepare for her day, about witnessing the small rituals that marked the transition from sleep to wakefulness, that spoke to the parts of himself he had thought permanently buried. As he prepared the coffee, grinding beans with the handmill that had been Martha's prized wedding gift, Silas found himself wondering what would happen now that the storm had passed. Eleanor had come to check on his welfare and tend his wounds, both of which she had accomplished. The path down the mountain would be difficult, but passable within a day or two. Her horse was well fed and rested. There was no practical reason for her to stay longer, and every reason for her to return to her students and her responsibilities in town. The thought of returning to solitude should have brought relief. For 3 days, his carefully ordered world had been disrupted by conversation and companionship, by the constant awareness of another person's needs and reactions. He should have been eager to reclaim his independence, to return to the simple rhythms that had sustained him through 7 winters of isolation. Instead, he found himself dreading the moment when Eleanor would announce her intention to leave, when the cabin would once again become a monument to his own stubborn insistence on living at arm's length from the world. "The path will be clear by tomorrow," Eleanor said, as if reading his thoughts. She had moved to the window and was studying the snow-laden landscape with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read mountain weather. "Maybe the day after if there's ice under the snow." Silas nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he tried to respond. He poured coffee into 2 chipped ceramic mugs, remnants of the set Martha had painted during the first year of their marriage. Most of the set had been broken over the years, some in the normal course of use, some in the rage and grief that had followed his return from war to find his family gone. But these 2 had survived, perhaps because he had unconsciously preserved them for moments like this. "I've been thinking," Eleanor continued, accepting the coffee with a smile that warmed him more than the hot liquid ever could, "about what you said yesterday, about grief being a comfortable place to hide." She settled back into the rocking chair, cradling the mug in both hands as if drawing strength from its warmth. "I've been hiding too in my own way. Not from people, the school makes that impossible, but from the possibility of having a family again. I've been so focused on other people's children that I've never allowed myself to consider that there might be room in my life for something more personal." Silas felt his pulse quicken, though he was not sure why. There was something in Eleanor's tone, something in the careful way she was choosing her words, that suggested this conversation was leading somewhere he had not expected to go. "What changed?" he asked quietly. Eleanor was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on something beyond the frosted window glass. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of a decision that had been building for longer than the 3 days she had spent in his cabin. "I found this," she said, reaching into the pocket of her dress and withdrawing something small and metallic. She held it out to him, and he saw that it was a simple gold band, worn thin by years of wear. It was Tom's wedding ring. "I put it away after he died, couldn't bear to see it sitting empty on the dresser. But when I was packing supplies to come up here, I found it again, and for the first time in 8 years, it didn't make me want to cry." She turned the ring over in her fingers, studying it as if seeing it for the first time. "I realized I had been treating Tom's memory the same way you've been treating Martha and Sarah's, as something too precious to risk disturbing with new experiences. But that's not what he would have wanted. Tom believed that love was meant to multiply, not to calcify into something that could only exist in the past." Silas set down his coffee and moved to sit in the chair across from her, the same chair where they had spent long hours playing chess and trading stories. "What are you saying, Eleanor?" She looked at him directly then, and in her eyes he saw a reflection of his own careful hope, his own growing recognition that the connection between them had moved beyond simple companionship into something that might demand more courage than either of them had expected to need. "I'm saying that I don't want to go back to Pine Ridge and pretend that these 3 days didn't change everything. I'm saying that I want to find out what happens when two people who have spent years protecting themselves decide to risk being vulnerable again." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge that had not yet been tested, like an invitation that required an answer but did not demand one. Silas felt his heart hammering against his ribs with a force that reminded him how long it had been since he had felt anything this intensely, how much easier it was to exist in the grey spaces between emotions than to risk the bright pain of actually caring about someone. But Eleanor was waiting, her coffee growing cold in her hands, her eyes steady on his face despite the obvious cost of her admission. She had laid herself bare in the way that only someone who had already lost everything could afford to do, with the reckless honesty of someone who understood that regret over words not spoken was worse than embarrassment over words that might be rejected. "I don't know how," Silas said finally. "I don't know how to be with someone again without being terrified that I'll lose them. I don't know how to let someone matter to me without spending every moment waiting for the other shoe to drop." Eleanor reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand in hers. Her fingers were calloused from years of writing on slate boards and tending to the cuts and scrapes that came with managing 16 active children, but her touch was gentle, undemanding. "Then we'll figure it out together," she said simply. "We'll take it slow, make mistakes, probably hurt each other's feelings more than once, but we'll do it honestly, and we'll do it with the understanding that some risks are worth taking even when you can't guarantee the outcome." Silas looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how natural it felt to be touched by someone again, how right it seemed to have another person's warmth anchoring him to the present moment. For 7 years he had avoided physical contact. With other human beings, had trained himself to function without the comfort of touch, without the simple reassurance that came from knowing you were not alone in your own skin. Now, with Eleanor's hand in his, he remembered what he had given, up in his determination to protect himself from further loss. He had not just avoided the possibility of pain, he had also avoided the possibility of joy, of connection, of the thousand small intimacies that made life worth living, rather than simply worth enduring. "The ring," he said, nodding toward Tom's wedding band, which Eleanor still held in her free hand. "What will you do with it?" Eleanor smiled, and there was something both sad and hopeful in her expression. "I think I'll put it away again, but not because it hurts to look at, because it belongs to a different part of my life, a part I'll always treasure but don't need to carry with me everywhere I go." She released his hand and moved to the mantelpiece, where she placed the ring next to one of his carved birds. A small, wooden robin that had been one of his first successful attempts at capturing the essence of something living in dead wood. The two objects sat side by side, the ring representing a love that had been complete in its time, the bird representing the possibility of creating something beautiful from raw material. "And this?" Silas asked, indicating the chain around his neck beneath his shirt, where Martha's ring had rested against his heart for 7 years. Eleanor returned to her chair, but did not sit down. Instead, she moved behind him and placed her hands on his shoulders, a gesture that was both comforting and challenging, that spoke to her willingness to support him while also asking him to make his own choices about what he was ready to let go. "That's up to you," she said quietly. "I'm not asking you to forget Martha and Sarah. I'm not asking you to pretend that what you had with them doesn't matter. I'm just asking you to consider the possibility that honoring their memory might mean allowing yourself to love again, rather than preserving their memory by refusing to." Silas reached up and covered one of her hands with his, feeling the strength in her fingers, the steady warmth of her pulse against his palm. He thought about Martha, about the way she had always encouraged him to take chances, to open his heart to new possibilities, even when doing so required more courage than he thought he possessed. He thought about Sarah, about her unlimited capacity for love, her instinctive understanding that the world was wide enough for infinite affection if you were brave enough to offer it. And for the first time in 7 years, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that they would not want him to spend the rest of his life as a monument to their absence, that they would want him to carry the best of what they had given him into whatever came next, to let their love be a foundation for new love rather than a barrier against it. "I'd like that," he said finally. "I'd like to try figuring it out with you." Eleanor's hands tightened on his shoulders, and he felt rather than saw her smile. Outside, the mountain morning was bright and clear, full of the kind of crystalline beauty that only came after storms. Inside the cabin, 2 people, who had spent years learning to live carefully, were taking their first tentative steps toward learning to live fully again. The next morning brought with it a decision that had been building since Eleanor first stepped through his door. The path down the mountain was clear, her horse was ready for travel, and her responsibilities in town were calling. But instead of preparing to leave, Eleanor sat at his table with her knitting needles flying, working on something that looked suspiciously like a scarf in shades of brown and grey that matched his eyes. "You don't have to do that," Silas said, though he found himself oddly touched by the domestic gesture. No one had knitted anything for him since Martha, and watching Eleanor's capable hands transform wool into something designed specifically for his comfort stirred feelings he had thought permanently buried. "I know I don't have to," Eleanor replied, without looking up from her work. "I want to. There's a difference." She paused to count stitches, her lips moving silently before continuing. "Besides, you'll need something warmer than that old coat when you come down to visit the school." The casual assumption in her words that he would indeed visit the school, that he would voluntarily leave his sanctuary to rejoin the world below, should have sparked his automatic resistance. For 7 years, he had avoided such commitments, such expectations that he might want or need connection with the community he had once called home. But instead of feeling trapped, he found himself curious about the possibility she was suggesting. "Would they want to see me?" he asked. "The children, I mean. It's been a long time since I've been around young folks." Eleanor smiled, and there was something maternal in her expression, something that suggested she understood children better than they understood themselves. "Children are remarkably adaptable creatures, Mr. McGraw. They don't carry the same baggage adults do about what should or shouldn't be. If you show up genuinely interested in what they're learning, genuinely willing to share what you know, they'll accept you exactly as you are." She held up her knitting to check her progress, and Silas could see that it was indeed a scarf worked in a simple but elegant pattern that would provide warmth without bulk. The wool was good quality, better than he would have purchased for himself, and dyed in colors that would suit him perfectly. "What would I have to share with them?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "I've been living alone for 7 years. I've forgotten how to be around people, forgotten how to make conversation about anything but the weather and the price of coffee." Eleanor set down her knitting and looked at him with the patient expression he was beginning to recognize as her teaching face, the look she probably wore when helping a student work through a problem they were convinced was beyond their abilities. "You've spent 7 years learning to survive in conditions that would kill most people," she said matter-of-factly. "You can read weather patterns, track animals, build and maintain shelter, preserve food, treat injuries, craft tools from raw materials. You understand the rhythms of the seasons in ways that most townspeople have forgotten. You can carve wood into art, play chess well enough to give me a decent game, and you've obviously been reading during your solitude, because your vocabulary hasn't suffered from lack of conversation." She picked up her knitting again, her needles, clicking in a rhythm that was somehow both businesslike and soothing. "Most importantly, you remember what it was like to be part of a community, to contribute something meaningful to the lives of people around you. That knowledge doesn't disappear just because you've been practicing isolation." Silas moved to the window and looked out at the winter landscape, trying to imagine himself walking into Eleanor's schoolhouse, trying to picture the faces of children who might see him as someone worth listening to rather than someone to be feared or pitied. The idea was both terrifying and oddly appealing. Terrifying because it would mean exposing himself to judgment and expectation. Appealing because it had been so long since he had felt useful for anything beyond his own survival. "What would I teach them?" he asked. "Whatever you wanted," Eleanor replied. "Practical skills, if that's what interests you. How to read animal tracks, how to identify edible plants, how to build a shelter that will keep you alive in a blizzard, or less practical things, wood carving, chess strategy, the stories that get passed down from one generation to the next. The specific subject doesn't matter as much as the willingness to share knowledge with young minds that are eager to absorb it." She paused in her knitting and looked up at him. "Or you could start with something simpler. Just visit. Let them see that the hermit in the mountains is actually a man who knows how to laugh, who has stories to tell, who might remember what it was like to be their age. Sometimes the most valuable thing an adult can give a child is proof that it's possible to survive the hard things life throws at you and still be fundamentally decent." The words hit him harder than he had expected. For 7 years, he had seen himself as someone who had been broken by loss, diminished by grief, reduced to a shadow of who he had once been. But Eleanor was suggesting a different interpretation, that his survival itself might have value, that the simple fact of his continued existence might serve as an example of resilience rather than just a testament to stubbornness. "I don't feel very decent most days," he admitted. "Neither do I," Eleanor said quietly. "Some mornings I wake up and wonder if I have anything left to give those children, if I'm just going through the motions because it's what I know how to do. But then I remember that Thomas would want me to keep teaching, keep sharing what I know, keep believing that education can make the world a little bit better, and somehow that's enough to get me through another day." She held up the scarf, examining her work with a critical eye before nodding in satisfaction. We're not required to feel wonderful about ourselves in order to be useful to other people, Silas. Sometimes the most honest thing we can offer is our imperfection, our ongoing struggle to make sense of what we've been given. Silas turned from the window and studied Eleanor's face, struck by the realization that she had just used his first name for the first time since arriving at his cabin. The casual intimacy of it sent warmth spreading through his chest, the same kind of warmth he had felt when she had taken his hand the night before. "Silas," he repeated, testing how it sounded in his own voice. "I'd forgotten how my name sounds when someone else says it." Eleanor smiled, and there was something almost shy in her expression, as if she too had noticed the subtle shift their relationship had taken. "It's a good name, strong but not harsh. The kind of name that suits a man who knows how to endure difficulty without becoming cruel." She set down her knitting and moved to stand beside him at the window. They stood shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the mountain landscape that had been his world for 7 years. And Silas was struck by how different it looked when viewed in companionship rather than solitude. The peaks were still imposing, the forests still vast and wild, but somehow the scene felt less like a barrier between him and the world, and more like a bridge that might be crossed when the time was right. "I've been thinking about what you said," Eleanor said softly, "about grief being a comfortable place to hide. I think loneliness can be comfortable too, in its own way. It's predictable, at least. You know what to expect from a day when you're the only person in it." Silas nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "No disappointments, no complications, no one to worry about except yourself. And no joy," Eleanor added. "No surprise. No one to share the good moments with, no one to help carry the difficult ones. It's safe, but it's not really living." She turned to face him, and in the morning light he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the silver threads in her hair, the small signs of a life that had been fully lived despite its sorrows. She was not a young woman, and neither was he a young man, but there was something ageless about the connection growing between them, something that transcended the specifics of age or circumstance. "I want to try living again," she said simply. "Not just existing, not just going through the motions, but actually embracing the possibility that there might be good things ahead as well as difficult ones. I want to try it with you if you're willing." Silas reached out and took her hands in his, marveling at how natural the gesture felt, how right it seemed to be touching someone again with intention rather than accident. Her hands were warm despite the winter air that seeped through the windows, and he could feel the slight tremor that revealed how much courage it had taken for her to make such an offer. "I'm willing," he said, and was surprised to discover that he meant it completely. "I don't know what I'm doing, and I can't promise I won't disappoint you, but I'm willing to try." Eleanor's smile was like sunrise after the longest night of winter, bright and warm and full of promise for the season to come. "That's all anyone can promise," she said. "The willingness to try, to keep showing up, to keep choosing connection even when it's scary." She pulled her hands free and returned to her knitting, but the atmosphere in the cabin had changed. Where there had been careful politeness, there was now the beginning of genuine intimacy. Where there had been the wariness of two people testing unknown ground, there was now the tentative confidence of two people who had decided the risk was worth taking. "Tell me about the children," Silas said, settling into his chair by the fire. "Tell me about Mary Chen and her gift for numbers, about the Henderson twins and their stories. If I'm going to visit your school, I want to know what I'm walking into." Eleanor's face lit up with the enthusiasm she reserved for her favorite subject, and as she began describing each of her students, their personalities, their challenges, their particular talents, Silas found himself looking forward to something for the first time in 7 years. Not just dreading the passage of time, not just enduring each day until it was safely behind him, but actually anticipating the future with something that felt dangerously like hope. Outside, the mountain winter continued its ancient rhythm, but inside the cabin, Two people who had spent years living in the past were beginning to imagine what their shared future might look like. The truth came out 3 days later, as Eleanor was preparing to finally make the journey back to town. She had delayed her departure twice, first claiming that the weather looked uncertain, then insisting that his leg needed more time to heal properly. But now the morning was clear, the path was solid, and her responsibilities could no longer be postponed without raising questions she was not yet ready to answer. Silas was loading supplies onto her horse, trying to ignore the hollow feeling that had settled in his chest at the thought of returning to solitude, when Eleanor spoke words that changed everything he thought he understood about her presence in his life. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice carrying a weight that made him pause in his work, "about why I really came up here." Something in her tone sent cold sliding down his spine. He turned to face her, noting the way she held herself, straight and determined, but with the tense readiness of someone preparing to absorb a blow. "I thought you came to check on my leg," he said carefully. Eleanor reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small, star-shaped piece of metal that caught the morning sun. As she held it out to him, Silas recognized it with a shock that nearly knocked him backward. A sheriff's badge, tarnished with age, but unmistakably official. "Sheriff Morrison sent me," she said quietly. "Not officially, you understand. Not as a deputy or anything like that. But he asked me to come up here, to check on your welfare, to see if the rumors were true." Silas stared at the badge, his mind reeling as it tried to process this revelation. What rumors? Eleanor's fingers closed around the badge. But she did not put it away. Instead, she held it like a talisman, something to anchor her as she delivered news that she clearly dreaded sharing. "There have been men asking about you in town," she said. "3 of them arrived about a month ago. They've been staying at the hotel, asking questions about a man named Silas McGraw, who used to live in these parts. They claim to be associates of yours from the war, say they have business to settle." The words hit Silas like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs and sending his heart hammering against his ribs. For 7 years, he had hidden in these mountains partly to escape his grief, but also to escape the complications of his past. Complications that involved more than just the loss of his family. "What kind of business?" he asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. They wouldn't say exactly. But Sheriff Morrison ran their names through his contacts in other territories. 2 of them have been wanted for questioning in connection with some incidents back east, disputes that turned violent, accusations of theft from military supplies, that sort of thing. The 3rd one has a cleaner record, but all 3 served under the same commanding officer you did during the war. Eleanor stepped closer, her expression shifting from apprehensive to protective. "Silas, Sheriff Morrison thinks these men might blame you for something that happened during your service, something that got them in trouble or cost them money." "Or they're right to blame me," Silas interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt like broken glass in his throat, cutting him as he spoke them. "I did cost them money, a lot of money." Eleanor's eyes widened, but she did not back away. "What do you mean?" Silas turned away from her, unable to meet her gaze, as he prepared to destroy the fragile trust they had built over the past week. He had known this moment would come eventually, had known that his past would catch up with him, that the choices he had made during the war would eventually demand payment. He had just hoped it would happen after he was dead, when the consequences could not touch anyone he cared about. "There was a supply depot," he said, staring out at the mountains that had sheltered him for 7 years. "Our unit was supposed to guard it while a larger force moved through the territory, but the depot was also being used to store supplies that were supposed to go to Confederate prisoners, medicine, food, blankets, basic humanitarian needs." He could feel Eleanor listening behind him, could sense her trying to understand where his story was leading. The commanding officer, Colonel Bradford, he had a side business selling those supplies to local merchants instead of distributing them to the prisoners. Made himself a tidy profit while men died of exposure and disease in camps that were supposed to be under his protection. Eleanor's sharp intake of breath told him she was beginning to understand the magnitude of what he was confessing. "And the 3 men who are looking for you?" Bradford's business partners. They were the ones who handled the actual sales, who transported the goods, who made sure the paperwork looked legitimate. They were making more money in a month than most soldiers saw in a year of fighting. Silas forced himself to turn around, to face Eleanor as he delivered the rest of his confession. "I found out what they were doing, saw them loading wagons with supplies that were supposed to go to the prison camps. I reported it to the military authorities, provided evidence, testified at the court-martial proceedings. You did the right thing," Eleanor said firmly. "I did the legal thing," Silas corrected, but Bradford and his partners didn't see it that way. They saw it as betrayal, as one of their own men destroying their operation for the sake of enemy soldiers who were probably going to die anyway. He moved to the cabin's porch and sat heavily on the steps, feeling the weight of 7 years' worth of buried guilt settling on his shoulders like snow. Bradford was court-martialed and executed. The 3 men were dishonorably discharged and lost everything they had invested in the operation. They swore they'd find me after the war, make me pay for destroying their lives. Eleanor joined him, on the steps, sitting close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body despite the cold morning air. "So you came here. You hid." "I came here because Martha and Sarah were dead, and I didn't know how to live in a world that didn't include them," Silas said. "But I stayed hidden, because I knew that sooner or later those 3 would come looking for me. I thought maybe if I disappeared completely, if I became a ghost story instead of a real person, they'd eventually give up and move on to other grievances." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and Silas braced himself for her judgment. He had allowed her to believe that he was simply a man grieving his losses, a hermit who had chosen isolation over connection. Instead, he was a man running from consequences, hiding from justice or revenge, depending on which side of the story you believed. "Sheriff Morrison knows all this?" she asked finally. Silas nodded. "I told him everything when I first came to these mountains. He's been keeping an eye on things, making sure no one who matched their descriptions got too close to finding me. When they showed up in town asking questions, he contacted me through the only person he knew could make the journey up here without attracting attention." "Me," Eleanor said. "You," Silas confirmed, "except he didn't count on you deciding to stay. For a week, didn't count on you getting personally involved in the situation." Eleanor was quiet for another long moment, and Silas found himself holding his breath as he waited for her reaction. Would she be angry that he had allowed her to care for him under false pretenses? Would she be frightened of the danger his presence might bring to her students, her community? Would she decide that a man with such complications in his past was not worth the risk of loving? When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and determined. "What do they want from you? These 3 men?" "I don't know for certain," Silas admitted. "Money, probably, though I don't have much. Revenge, definitely. They lost everything because of my testimony, their military careers, their business, their reputations. Men like that don't forget that kind of humiliation." Eleanor reached over and took his hand, her fingers warm and strong despite the morning chill. "Then we'll face them together." Silas stared at her, unable to believe what he was hearing. "Eleanor, you don't understand. These are dangerous men. They've had 7 years to nurse their grievances, 7 years to plan what they want to do to me. You need to go back to town, warn Sheriff Morrison that they're getting close, and then stay as far away from me as possible until this is resolved." Eleanor's grip on his hand tightened. "I understand perfectly. You're a man who did the right thing during a war, who saved, lives by reporting corruption, who has been punished for his integrity by men who value profit over human decency. And now those men have finally found you, and you think the best response is to face them alone." She turned to look at him directly, and in her eyes he saw the same quiet steel that had carried her through the loss of her husband and son, the same determination that had driven her to risk a mountain blizzard to check on his welfare. "I didn't come up here just because Sheriff Morrison asked me to," she said. "I came because I care what happens to you, and that didn't change when I learned the full story. If anything, it makes me more determined to make sure you don't disappear again." Silas felt something crack inside his chest, not breaking but opening, like ice giving way to spring warmth. For 7 years, he had carried the weight of his choices alone, had assumed that anyone who learned the truth about his past would see him as a liability, a complication to be avoided. But Eleanor was looking at him as if his integrity was something to be protected rather than something to be ashamed of. "They could hurt you," he said desperately. "They could hurt your students, use them as leverage to get to me. I won't have innocent people suffering because of choices I made during the war." Eleanor smiled, and there was something almost fierce in her expression. "Then we'd better make sure they understand that Silas McGraw is not a man who stands alone anymore, that he has a community that values him, a woman who loves him, and a sheriff who takes a dim view of men who come to his territory looking for trouble." The words, "a woman who loves him," hung in the air between them like a bridge that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. Silas stared at Eleanor, hardly daring to believe that she had just declared her love for him in the same breath as accepting the danger that loving him might bring. "You love me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor leaned over and kissed him, soft and warm and certain. "I love you," she confirmed against his lips. "All of you, including the parts of your past that make you who you are. Now stop trying to protect me from my own choices and help me figure out how we're going to protect each other." As Silas pulled Eleanor into his arms, feeling her solid warmth against his chest, he realized that everything had changed again. He was no longer a hermit hiding from his past, and she was no longer a schoolteacher making a welfare check. They were partners now, bound together not just by growing affection, but by shared danger and common purpose. The 3 men from his past were coming, and this time he would not face them alone. They spent the next 2 days preparing for what felt like an inevitable confrontation. Eleanor rode back to town to inform Sheriff Morrison of the situation and to make arrangements for her students' safety, while Silas began the grim work of transforming his peaceful cabin into something that could be defended if necessary. The military training that had lain dormant for 7 years came flooding back with startling clarity. He checked his weapons. The hunting rifle, a pistol he had not touched since the war, a collection of knives that could serve purposes beyond skinning game. He studied the approaches to his cabin with tactical eyes, identifying positions that could provide cover, routes that could serve as escape paths, vulnerabilities that would need to be reinforced or defended. But as he worked, Silas found himself thinking not just about strategy and survival, but about the man he had been during the war, the man who had seen corruption and chosen to act despite the personal cost, the man who had valued principle over profit and integrity over safety. For 7 years, he had thought of his wartime service primarily in terms of its consequences: the time away from Martha and Sarah, the enemies he had made, the complications that had driven him into hiding. But Eleanor's unwavering support had reminded him that there had been honor in his choices as well as cost. Hidden beneath his floorboards, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it from 7 winters of mountain moisture, was a small metal box containing the tangible reminders of his military service. Silas had not opened it since arriving at the cabin, had tried to bury those memories as completely as he had buried his grief. But now, with Eleanor's declaration of love still warming his heart and the prospect of danger requiring him to remember who he had been as well as who he had become, he found himself lifting the loose boards and retrieving the box. Inside, along with his discharge papers and a few letters from commanding officers, was the medal he had received for his actions during the supply depot incident. a simple bronze star that recognized his service to the Union cause and his commitment to the principles for which they had fought. At the time, it had felt like small compensation for the enemies he had made and the threats he had earned. But looking at it now, remembering Eleanor's fierce pride in his integrity, Silas realized that it represented something more valuable than he had understood. Proof that doing the right thing mattered, even when it was difficult, even when it came at great personal cost. Eleanor returned the next morning with news that was both encouraging and troubling. Sheriff Morrison had agreed to increase patrols in the area and had sent word to neighboring territories about the three men and their potential intentions. But the men themselves had disappeared from the hotel in Pine Ridge, leaving behind forwarding information and taking all their possessions with them. "They know we're onto them," Eleanor said, as she unpacked fresh supplies and checked the bandage on Silas's leg, which was healing well despite the stress of recent revelations. "Morrison thinks they've gone to ground somewhere in the mountains, probably trying to locate your cabin without being seen." Silas nodded grimly. He had expected as much. Men who had survived military service and lived outside the law for 7 years would not be easily discouraged by the threat of official intervention. They would be patient, careful, and determined to finish what they had come to accomplish. "There's something else," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a weight that made him look up from the rifle he was cleaning. "I brought this back from town, found it in my desk at the school." She held out a small gold locket, tarnished with age, but obviously precious to her. When she opened it, Silas saw the tiny photograph inside, a young boy with Eleanor's serious eyes and a smile that spoke of unlimited possibilities. "Thomas," she said quietly. "I've been carrying his memory in my pocket for 8 years, afraid that if I didn't hold on to every detail, I might forget what he looked like, how he laughed, what it felt like to be his mother." Silas understood the gesture she was making. Just as he had retrieved his military medal, Eleanor was confronting the artifacts of her own past, the physical reminders of love that had been lost and dreams that had been deferred. "But I realized something while I was in town, talking to Sheriff Morrison, making arrangements to protect my students," she continued. "I realized that I've been so busy preserving Thomas's memory exactly as it was that I never allowed myself to imagine what he might have become, what he might have wanted for me." She closed the locket but did not put it away, instead holding it as she had held Tom's wedding ring, with love and respect, but without the desperate clinging that had characterized her grief for so many years. "He was always trying to take care of me, even when he was little, always asking if I was sad, always trying to make me laugh when he thought I needed cheering up. And I think—" her voice caught, and she had to pause before continuing. "I think if he could see me now, if he could know that I finally found someone who makes me want to risk loving again, he'd be happy for me. He'd want me to choose life over mourning, hope over safety." Silas set down his rifle and moved to where Eleanor sat at his table. Without speaking, he reached up and unclasped the chain that had hung around his neck for 7 years, the chain that held Martha's wedding ring. He had worn it so long that it felt like part of his body, but as he lifted it over his head, he realized that it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it felt like a blessing he was finally ready to share. "Martha used to say that love wasn't something you held on to," he said, placing the ring on the table next to Eleanor's locket. "She said it was something you gave away, something that grew stronger when it was shared rather than hoarded." He looked at Eleanor, this woman who had walked into his life carrying supplies and hope and the quiet insistence that he deserved better than the half-existence he had constructed for himself. "I think she'd like you," he said. "I think she'd be glad that I found someone who understands that honoring the past doesn't mean refusing to embrace the future." Eleanor reached across the table and took his hands in hers, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that felt both comforting and promising. "We're going to face this together," she said. "Whatever those men want, whatever they're planning, we'll face it as partners." And when it's over, when we've proven that you don't have to spend the rest of your life hiding from the consequences of doing the right thing, we're going to build something new together. The sound of approaching horses cut through the morning. Stillness, like a blade through silk. Both Silas and Eleanor froze, listening as the hoofbeats grew closer, as voices began to carry on the thin mountain air. 3 men from the sound of it, riding with the careful precision of people who had found what they were looking for and were prepared to take it. Silas reached for his rifle, but Eleanor's hand on his arm stopped him. "Wait," she said quietly. "Let's see what they want first. Maybe we can resolve this without violence." The riders came into view through the cabin's front window. 3 men in their 40s, weathered by years of hard living, armed but not with weapons drawn. They sat their horses with military precision, studying the cabin and its surroundings with professional assessment. These were not desperate outlaws come for quick revenge, but soldiers who had planned their approach carefully and were prepared for multiple possibilities. The man in the center, clearly the leader, dismounted and approached the cabin door with measured steps. When he knocked, it was with the same controlled authority Silas remembered from their shared military service. "Silas McGraw," the man called. "It's Daniel Crenshaw. I know you're in there, and I know you're armed, but we're not here to fight. We're here to talk." Silas felt Eleanor's surprised glance, but kept his attention focused on the door. Daniel Crenshaw had been Bradford's lieutenant, the most intelligent of the 3 conspirators, and the one Silas had respected most, despite their fundamental disagreement about military ethics. "Talk about what, Daniel?" Silas called back, his rifle ready but not yet aimed. "About the fact that you were right," Crenshaw replied, and there was something in his voice that Silas had not expected. Not anger or threat, but what sounded like regret. "About Bradford, about the supply theft, about all of it. You were right, and we were wrong, and it's taken us 7 years to work up the courage to admit it." Eleanor looked at Silas with raised eyebrows, clearly not having expected this development. Neither had he. In all his preparations for this confrontation, he had assumed the 3 men were seeking revenge, not reconciliation. "What do you want, Daniel?" Silas asked again. "To apologize," Crenshaw said simply. "To thank you for doing what we should have done, and to ask if you might be willing to help us with something that could set right some of the damage we caused." Silas looked at Eleanor, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in her eyes. This was not the scenario they had prepared for, not the confrontation they had expected. But Eleanor nodded slightly, encouraging him to at least hear what Crenshaw had to say. "All right," Silas called. "You can come in, but your friends stay outside where I can see them." "Fair enough," Crenshaw agreed. Silas opened the door to find Daniel Crenshaw looking older and wearier than their shared military service would account for. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and moral reckonings, a gravity in his bearing that suggested the intervening years had not been kind to him. "Ma'am," Crenshaw said, nodding respectfully to Eleanor as he entered the cabin. "I'm sorry to intrude on your home." "Mr. Crenshaw," Eleanor replied with the composed dignity she brought to all social situations. "I'm Eleanor Whitfield, and this is Silas's home as much as mine." The subtle claim of shared ownership was not lost on Crenshaw, who glanced between them with understanding. "I see. Well, that makes this easier in some ways, more complicated in others." He moved to the center of the cabin, but did not sit. Instead, standing with the military bearing that had never quite left him. "Silas, I need you to know that we didn't come here for revenge. We came because we need your help, and because we owe you an apology that's 7 years overdue." "Help with what?" Silas asked, his rifle still ready but no longer aimed directly at his unexpected visitor. "There are more men like Bradford still out there," Crenshaw said. "Men who are still stealing supplies meant for prisoners, still profiteering from human suffering, still using military authority to line their own pockets. And because of what happened to us after you exposed Bradford's operation, We're in a unique position to identify them, to gather evidence, to make sure they face the same justice Bradford faced. Crenshaw reached into his coat and withdrew a thick folder wrapped in oilcloth. We've spent the last 3 years documenting corruption in military supply lines across the territories. Names, dates, financial records, witness testimonies, everything needed to bring these men to justice. But we can't present this evidence ourselves. Our own dishonored discharges make us unreliable witnesses in any court proceeding. He set the folder on Silas's table next to the locket and wedding ring that represented the past both men were learning to honor without being imprisoned by. We need someone with an honorable service record, someone who has already proven he's willing to do the right thing, regardless of personal cost. We need you to take this evidence to the appropriate authorities and make sure it gets the attention it deserves. Silas stared at the folder, understanding beginning to dawn. You want me to do what I did to Bradford? To more men like him, we want you to finish what you started, Crenshaw confirmed. Bradford was just one man in a network of corruption that stretched across multiple territories. By exposing him, you cut off one head of the Hydra, but the rest of the creature is still alive and still feeding. Eleanor moved to stand beside Silas, her hand coming to rest on his shoulder in a gesture of support. What would happen to you and your friends if Silas agrees to this? Crenshaw smiled, and for the first time since entering the cabin, he looked genuinely hopeful. We'd finally be able to stop running, stop hiding, stop carrying the weight of knowing that our silence is allowing other men to profit from suffering the way we once did. He looked directly at Silas, and in his eyes was the recognition of one soldier acknowledging another, not as enemies, but as men who had both learned hard lessons about honor and consequences and the price of doing what was right. I know we hurt you, Crenshaw said quietly. I know our threats drove you into hiding, cost you years of your life that you can never get back. But if you can find it in yourself to forgive us, to trust us one more time, we can make sure that what you did during the war matters for more than just the one corrupt officer you exposed. Silas looked at Eleanor, seeing in her expression the same mixture of caution and hope he was feeling. This was not the confrontation they had prepared for, but it was perhaps the resolution that his past deserved. Not revenge or violence, but the opportunity to transform old wounds into new purpose. If I do this, Silas said slowly, if I take your evidence and present it to the authorities, what guarantee do I have that you won't disappear again? That you'll be available to testify if your evidence leads to prosecutions? Crenshaw reached into another pocket and withdrew 3 signed documents, sworn statements from each of us, witnessed and notarized, confessing our own past crimes and agreeing to testify in any proceedings that result from this evidence. We're done running, Silas. We're ready to face the consequences of our actions and to make amends for the damage we've caused. Eleanor squeezed Silas's shoulder gently, and he could feel her silent encouragement, her belief in his ability to make the right choice. He thought about the bronze medal hidden in his military box, about the principle it represented, about the man he had been during the war, and the man he was trying to become again. All right, he said finally. I'll do it. I'll take your evidence to the proper authorities and make sure it gets the attention it deserves. Crenshaw's shoulders sagged with visible relief. Thank you. I know this doesn't erase what we put you through, but it's a start. He moved toward the door, then paused and looked back. For what it's worth, Silas, you were the best of us during the war. The most honorable, the most principled, the most willing to do what was right regardless of the cost. We should have followed your example instead of making you pay for setting it. After Crenshaw left with his companions, after the sound of hoofbeats had faded into the mountain silence, Silas and Eleanor sat at the table, looking at the folder that represented both vindication for past choices and responsibility for future. Uns, are you ready for this? Eleanor asked gently, Silas opened the folder and began reading the carefully documented evidence of ongoing corruption, feeling the familiar weight of moral obligations settling on his shoulders. But this time, it did not feel like a burden he would have to carry alone. "I'm ready," he said, reaching for Eleanor's hand. "We're ready." 3 months later, Silas stood in a federal courthouse in Denver, presenting evidence that would lead to the conviction of 16 corrupt military officers and the recovery of thousands of dollars in stolen supplies. Eleanor sat in the gallery, behind him, wearing a new dress and a smile that spoke of pride in the man she loved and anticipation of the life they were building together. The proceedings took 2 weeks, during which Silas testified with the same clear-eyed honesty that had marked his original exposure of Bradford's corruption. But this time, instead of facing threats and isolation, he found himself surrounded by supporters. Eleanor, Sheriff Morrison, Daniel Crenshaw and his 2 companions, and a growing network of people who understood that integrity was something to be celebrated rather than punished. When the trials were over and justice had been served, Silas and Eleanor returned to the mountains, not to hide, but to build. The cabin that had been Silas's refuge became their shared home, expanded and improved to accommodate 2 lives instead of 1. Eleanor continued teaching, but now her classroom included adults from town who came up the mountain to learn practical skills from Silas, while children made regular trips to see the hermit who had become their friend and teacher. On a spring morning exactly 1 year after Eleanor had first knocked on his door during the blizzard, Silas carved 2 simple rings from mountain oak and asked Eleanor to marry him. She said yes with tears in her eyes and laughter in her voice, and they were wed in the schoolhouse that Silas had helped build, surrounded by the community that had never stopped believing in the possibility of his redemption. As they stood together, in the morning sunlight, Eleanor wearing the hand-knitted scarf she had made for him, and Silas carrying the confidence that came from knowing he belonged somewhere again. Both understood that love was not about replacing what had been lost, but about honoring it by embracing what could be found. Martha's ring and Thomas's locket sat on the mantelpiece of their shared home, no longer symbols of grief, but reminders of love's capacity to grow and change and find new expressions even after loss seems absolute. And in the evenings, when the mountain air was soft with the promise of summer and the firelight danced on the walls of the cabin that had sheltered both solitude and companionship, Silas and Eleanor would sit together planning lessons for her, students dreaming of the children who might someday fill their home with laughter and marveling at the mystery of second chances. Some wounds never heal, they had learned, but they teach us to live differently, not alone, but together, not in fear of loss, but in gratitude for love, not as prisoners of the past, but as architects of a future that honors what we have been given and embraces what we might yet become.